Great.
So I'll turn it over to Larry.
Sure. Um, Thank you very much, Sherry. And again, my name is Larry Rohrbough. I'm Executive Director of the Trust Science Technology Center. As Sherry mentioned, we discussed a little bit earlier, we're doing some very interesting work that I think is very complementary to what I3P is doing, and also from sort of a structural and organizational standpoint, there are a lot of similarities. So some of you may be familiar with Trust, but if not, I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about it, and I'll try to get through this. I don't have a lot of slides, but I'll try to get through it so that I can leave some time for questions and discussions, and I'm certainly around the rest of the day as well. So Trust is it's a National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center, STC. It's one of 17 active centers now. Every few years, NSF does calls, solicitations for these STCs, but the Science and Technology Center program has been around for a long time, and it's one of the flagship programs within NSF. Some of you, I apologize if you know all about this, but it's one of the larger investments that NSF makes. So our class of centers, the investment was over 10 years at about $4 million. The current class that started in 2010 is $5 billion a year for 10 years. So $50 million from NSF is a pretty substantial investment. But they also have a lot of, there's a lofty goal for these centers. So they expect you to do really far-reaching research that requires you to bring together multi-institutional teams, multidisciplinary teams, interdisciplinary projects, and really look at things that are solving societal scale problems. If you look online at the STC program, you'll see there's a wide range of topics from sort of the science end of it to the technology end, and we're more on the technology side. We're the only center that's focused on cybersecurity. There are others that are looking at energy efficient electronics or biophotonics, or one of the centers that's in our class from 2005 is actually looking at polar ice caps and that sort of thing, sort of effects on climate. And so there's some that are earth sciences, some that are natural sciences, some that are more physical sciences, and then there's some that are like Trust that are more in kind of the IT and computer science and engineering realm. This Office of Integrative Activities runs these, and we happen to be aligned with SIZE. Each of the centers has a sort of a technical directorate that they get direct management from, but then we also sort of report up to somebody within OIA. So we have kind of a dual reporting there within NSF. It's been a fantastic opportunity for us, and we've really enjoyed having the center. We're in our 8th year now, so we are coming into the last 3 years of the center. So we're certainly thinking about a lot of the sustainment and kind of legacy issues that I heard come up today as well. So we are certainly looking for opportunities that, if there are possibilities that some of the research that we've been doing, it can be leveraged, or some of the investment that NSF has made could be leveraged for some of your projects. We'd be open to talking about that with you. I have one slide here that just to give you a sense of what Trust is doing. So Trust, I mentioned, it's the one center that's addressing a lot of security issues, looking at cyber infrastructure. We're also kind of looking at a lot of fundamental ways in which these systems can be designed, built, and deployed in a more secure manner, and in a more privacy-preserving way as well. So the last few years we've gotten into looking more at the privacy aspects of all of these systems, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. We have, we call kind of these grand challenge problems. So just as background, when the center proposal was put in 2004, I think we had about 13 topic areas that we were going to cover. We were going to change the world in all these different security areas. And back then it was more traditional security. It was addressing things like phishing attacks. It was web security. It was encryption. It was network security. It was protocols and so forth. Over the last few years, these have evolved. Obviously, the security landscape is very different than it was in 2004. And with that, we changed the focus of our center. And so we've kind of boiled everything down into 3 main areas that I'll talk about in a minute. And really, this came out of a review that we had of the center a few years ago, where a comment that was made that really stuck with us was that we were on a trajectory to make incremental changes in a lot of different areas and not really make big changes in any one area. And so we really took that to heart and did these studies to sort of take a step back and look at where we could really make an impact given the substantial resources that we had from NSF, the opportunity we're given with NSF, and the wealth of knowledge we had across all of our partner institutions. So Berkeley's the lead institution, but we have a lot of people and active research participation from Carnegie Mellon, Cornell, Vanderbilt, and Stanford. And then we also have education and outreach partnerships, kind of a hook into the Cal State university system through San Jose State, which has really been very forward-thinking in a lot of their teaching and training and workforce development and human resource development activities. And so we've been a good feeder. They've been a good feeder for us into the CSU program. The numbers here you'll see, just to give you a sense of the size across all the center. Majority of the funding and a lot of the people goes into graduate students. And most of these are PhD students. We have some master's students, but the majority of them are pursuing PhDs in something security or privacy related. And we have a number of different disciplines, so I'll talk about projects in a minute, but typically what we have is all of our projects either have more than one institution involved with them or more than one discipline or both. And so you'll see we'll pair up people from computer science and law or social scientists working with engineers to address some of these security problems. So the way the center is structured, and some of this kind of comes from the way NSF kind of mandated how these SDCs are set up. But research is obviously the core of what we do. And you'll see here in the middle, the three main areas that I talked about are kind of these three grand challenge focus areas that we really have used to drive the research across the center for the last few years. And so within there are probably anywhere from 10 to 15 projects, individual projects that focus on those areas. And then we have some other things, projects that deal with public policy, privacy issues, and also we have a fairly substantial science of security component that crosses all three of those. And so I didn't really call those out here, but we do have work that's ongoing within each of the three application areas that deals with broader issues of security and privacy, where the intersection of those are, or more fundamental science of security issues. The research activities drive a lot of our education programs, and so we have a full spectrum of activities, sort of traditional publishing papers and writing books, but also we've developed new courses. We have some novel programs that bring in undergraduate students to the center every year and expose them to security topics. We run seminars. This WISE is a program every summer we have for women. It's a women's institute. And so we really, from these, we recruit nationally to bring in people from outside the center to spend anywhere from a week to a couple of months with center researchers. So they really get a direct exposure to what we're doing. And I'll talk a little bit later about some success stories we've had in terms of some of the students that have come through or some of the junior faculty that have come through and kind of how that's helped their career. We also have what NSF calls knowledge transfer, sort of tech transition. So we have a number of industry partners we work with. There are a number of other government agencies we work with as well. So we really look for ways in which we can leverage the fundamental research that's coming out of the center and partner with people who have real world problems to solve. And there's certainly benefit to us, there's benefit to the companies as well. And we've been looking in the last 2-3 years more internationally. So we've established some partnerships with some international centers. Angela Sastry, she came to Trust a couple years ago, and I've heard about when her center got established, and I think that's great. We don't have any formal connection with them, but certainly the science and security work that we're doing is very complementary to that as well.
Larry, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
How much funding has come from the companies, from the private sector into Trust as you built this knowledge transfer function?
I'd say as a percentage, it's probably been 10 to 15%, maybe. So, in any given year, that might translate into a few $100,000. Yeah. I mean, we've had some years where it's been higher and some years where it's been lower. But over the years, if you think about relative to what we get from NSF and the other, and it's usually in the order of a couple $100,000, maybe per project.
For a specific project.
Right. And we've had some larger, several $100,000 sort of multi-year projects and as well. So yeah, we have a range of there. And I'll talk a little bit in the end about we have an industrial membership program that we pitch to our industry partners that we work with, and sort of dictates some of the terms about how we collaborate and what the funding goes to and so forth. I won't get into all the projects, but I wanted to give a couple of highlights of some of the projects we're doing in that physical infrastructures area. So you saw a couple slides ago, we're looking at financial services and banking and finance systems. We're looking at healthcare and healthcare IT systems. I won't talk about any of those. I'd be happy to offline, but in the interest of time, I wanted to mention a couple of the projects we're doing in what we call the physical infrastructures area. So this is really looking at critical cyber infrastructure systems. One that actually has some aspects that are very similar to what Dan just talked about in his talk is a project that is primarily being driven by Ken Berman up at Cornell that's looking essentially at applying high assurance techniques for developing high assurance systems to the smart grid. So rather than taking kind of the traditional approach of looking at building out the smart grid, advanced metering infrastructure and so forth, and applying kind of the typical technique to doing demand response and all that, he's taking a look at applying some of the technologies he's built for things like air traffic control systems. Some of this has been implemented in the French stock market exchange, the systems in the back end there. Some complementary work that's been done with Amazon. So these are high assurance systems that need to be up and reliable. And he's kind of taken a novel approach to thinking about applying those to the smart grid context, including looking at ways of developing a really new operating environment for this. And so not building on some of the traditional control systems and the traditional hierarchy that's in your energy infrastructure today. And there's more information on this. I'd be happy to talk more about it later. Well, another area that's work that's being led by Shankar Sastry at UC Berkeley is looking at resilient network control systems. So this is kind of next generation, not just next generation SCADA, but really thinking about applying traditional IT security to the problem, in addition to what we call robust control, but then also looking at economics and other incentive mechanisms to really improve the security, robustness, reliability of these next generation control systems. So again, this is thinking about the various types of threats and new threats that are being developed against some of these systems. Thinking about ways in which you can quantify attacks versus faults versus just other anomalous activity or just normal activity that occurs within the system. And then quantifying that and applying some mechanisms by which you can improve the resilience and reliability of these. And so this is some work that's been going on the last couple of years, and we are just starting, in fact, now a large offshoot program with Trust and some other partners that's coming out of the NSF, Helen Gill's CPS, the Cyber Physical Systems Program, called Forces. We also, as part of our international kind of aspects of the center, a couple of years ago, we were a part of a large FP7 program, which is the EU, European Union, one of these funding vehicles. We partnered up with a number of organizations in Europe, including ABB and E.ON, and some consulting companies to look at security and resilience of the power transmission and distribution, primarily in the Swedish power grid. So ABB was our big partner there. And this program is called Viking, and we were looking at a number of the ways in which we could improve the control systems within their energy infrastructure. And that was very successful. There were a lot of recommendations that came out of this, and then they actually implemented some of these solutions over in the power grid there. So we were very happy about that. Unfortunately, it was about a 3-year program, and it ended recently, and there wasn't much follow-on to that, which was a little disappointing to us, but we were pleased with the results there. We also had a project a couple of years ago with EADS, which is if you're not familiar with them, they're a large defense and homeland security company based in France and Germany. They're kind of split. They were interested in, within their infrastructure, including the Airbus division, moving to IPv6. And so they were evaluating all these ways in which that would impact their current infrastructure, and one of those was security. And so they didn't really have a way in which they could effectively test and evaluate some security aspects of implementing IPv6. So we had about a year or so long project with them where we used the Deter testbed, which I know Anthony Joseph's here involved with I3P, and he may have briefed the group on Deter. But this is an emulation testbed that NSF and DHS fund that's got several hundred nodes between Berkeley and USC ISI down here. And we worked closely with EADS to model their internal network on Deter. So we used machines to emulate a lot of the devices that would be within their aircraft and their avionics systems. And then they ran a number of tests to look at different, how different attacks were, what kind of effects they had on the system and what sort of improvements they could make. And they wanted to do this, 120 nodes was kind of their capstone project, which was, it doesn't sound very large, but actually for what they could do, they were looking at being able to do like half a dozen. And so they were really able to take advantage of this, the test bed and the expertise that we had within Trust on using the test bed for very large scale experiments. They used the results of this then to make some investments internally within the company on where to go with IPv6. We talked a little bit this morning about science of security. So we do have a large component within Trust, primarily over the last, I'd say, 2 to 3 years. Fred Schneider is the chief scientist of Trust, and he's been a big proponent of this. Shankar Sastry at Berkeley, John Mitchell at Stanford, and Anupam Datta at Carnegie Mellon have all worked very closely in looking at some of these ways in which, as it says here, really advancing a science base and looking at ways in which you can really build security into these systems from the beginning and not think of it as an afterthought. And Fred, of course, works very hard to not get on his soapbox about this, but he's got some very strong opinions, as you've heard, about this as well. And he's been a real proponent of driving some of these principles into each of the 3 application areas listed here. So these are just some examples of the types of projects or things we're looking at from more of this fundamental science perspective across all of the application areas. So we're looking at these fundamental ways in which we can improve security, but then applying it to these 3 kind of grand challenge areas that we have that are looking at the physical infrastructures, financial systems, and also healthcare and health IT. And as part of this too, and a little bit of what gets into the next topic about outreach, is that we've also had people been involved for the last few years in some of these activities to really build up this science of security. So Fred has been a big proponent of this, but we've had people as far back as 3 years ago who supported a Jason study that was focused on science of cybersecurity. Fred, John Mitchell at Stanford, and John Schwang at Berkeley, who's more of an economist. They all briefed the study group and sort of provided input into that. And that, plus some work that led to a MURI, which was established I think it was set up last year, but it was in the last recent call for the MURIs, have really kind of brought a lot more attention to this area. And also, frankly, what Fred and John and others have really tried to do is get the government investment to sort of match what they're saying in terms of where they really want to go with this area. And so that something like this MURI is not large, but it is an investment in looking at this, and it brought in trust institutions plus some researchers at the University of Pennsylvania as well. We've also been involved in one of the things in the most recent NIDR-D list of research activities was adding economics, but also science of security too. So this, again, required a little bit of lobbying and kind of growing the research community to kind of say this is something that's important and elevating it to a level that's on par with the other research activity areas, the thrust that they had defined before. We had people contribute to a special issue of IEEE S&P, and then also Fred and a few others wrote articles for, actually it's not Brad's magazine, but the NSA Next Wave magazine, and that was focused all on science of cybersecurity, which was really the first time I think they had dedicated so much of the magazine to a particular topic. From the standpoint of taking what we've done over the last several years within Trust, I wanted to mention a couple of examples of things that have come out of the center that we like to think of as national initiatives that were inspired by Trust research. So I mentioned this, the MURI in science of security. And we'd been doing science of security work for probably a year or two before this came out. So we like to think that that helped influence this. And we certainly, when we put the proposal in, we made an effort to bring in other people as well. So that's how UPenn got involved with that. 2 years ago, Intel, for those of you who don't know, Intel has funded lablets across the country, and they recently essentially disbanded them all and kind of did an internal process where they reevaluated where they wanted to invest some of their academic research money and how they wanted to establish these this sort of new generation of centers that coincidentally they call Science and Technology Centers, or STCs. Intel established one at Berkeley on campus that focuses on secure computing. There are several others across the country. I know CMU has a couple and Stanford has one, and there are others. But their security one was really driven by a lot of the success we had working with them when they were off campus, but we partnered very closely with them, and we're looking at a lot of areas of security that were relevant to their business. And so this is something that's looking at, it's essentially end user security. And it kind of has the same model of there's a transition path with the research. So the team is made up of academic researchers and also employees of Intel sitting side by side on a floor in Soda Hall at Berkeley, so in the computer science building. But again, besides Berkeley and CMU that were involved in the security work before, we also pulled in Drexel and people from Duke and Illinois. So we've expanded the team, and so we're really excited about that. And that's a multi-year, I think it's a 5-year investment with the opportunity to renew it. And I didn't talk too much about what we're doing with healthcare and healthcare IT systems, but one of the projects that came out of some of that work was one project within a larger program called SHARP, which came out of Health and Human Services, and the S is for security here. So SHARPS is dealing with security and privacy issues for health information exchanges, personal health records, electronic medical records, remote monitoring of patients and so forth. And this builds on a lot of the work that we've done within Trust from very early on. And Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, Vanderbilt, plus a whole number. The team's probably about 15 people. Plus, interestingly with this, there are 3 or 4 hospitals involved, like research hospitals and teaching hospitals that are very, very actively involved in terms of providing data, providing test environments where the team can deploy some of the technology, and really working very closely together, which is a really interesting model, especially given the fact that you've got, primarily computer scientists and engineers then working with physicians and healthcare providers. They don't often speak the same language and think about problems in the same way. So this has brought them together to really look at some of these fundamental security and privacy problems. Another aspect I touched on was the education and diversity part of the center. We have a number of programs, but I wanted to mention a couple that we are very proud of because they've been very successful to us and also have brought in a number of students to participate in the center. And one of them is our REU, the Research Experiences for Undergraduates. So we run it was an 8-week program. We've expanded it this year to 9 weeks. So we bring in students that we recruit from all over the country to all of our partner institutions. And we place anywhere from, maybe 3 to 15, depending on how many they're willing to take. And these students come in and they work directly with our graduate students, with our faculty advisors, and they work on very specific problems that are well-defined before they come in, that are scoped such that they can accomplish something at the end of the 8 or 9 weeks. And we provide an awful lot of support as far as giving them a real hands-on experience in what it's like to go to grad school, because these are typically students who come from institutions where they don't get exposed to research at all. They may have great grades and they may have taken a lot of the prerequisite classes, but they haven't actually done research. And so if they're thinking about graduate school or would like to get a sense of what it's like to do work at the graduate level, this gives them a great opportunity to do that. And we support them with housing, with travel stipends, a travel allowance, a pretty substantial travel stipend as well. And so far, we're doing the eighth summer of it now. We've hosted 90 students so far, and you can kind of see the demographics are pretty good too if you compare that to what at the undergraduate level in computer science and engineering, the numbers as far as female undergraduate students and underrepresented minority students are significantly lower than that. So we really try to recruit heavily and advertise this at conferences and at workshops and with departments where they have students who would be interested in a program like this, but that also are maybe have a large number of female students or underrepresented minority students. We've also are leveraging the collaboration we have with industry partners to run a security internship program in the summer. So this is directed at graduate students, again, recruited nationally. Sometimes we'll pull them from within the center, but most of the students who have participated in this have come from other institutions. But we partner with Bay Area companies, and the list down here are all the ones who have participated so far, to put together a 10-week program where they come in. In some sense, it's a traditional internship for the summer, but what we've arranged with these companies is that they work with the company 4 days a week, and 1 day a week, on Mondays, we pull them out, and we run an all-day seminar. So we give them an opportunity to hear from faculty and grad students, from trust institutions, partner institutions, or we'll bring in outside speakers from other companies or maybe government agencies or government labs who are doing some interesting security work. And so we give them kind of a flavor of what we're doing from an academic research perspective, but the objective of it really is at the end of the summer, they get a lot of hands-on experience. And 2011, you can kind of see roughly what these interns earned, and I forget if it's something about like $35, $40 an hour. I mean, it's a fairly substantial amount that they make. And we've had a few of them who've been offered jobs at the end of it and so forth, so we sort of feel like there's a nice way in which we're contributing to building this pipeline of, in this case, people that are more working professionals rather than those going on to graduate school. But there's certainly a need for them as well, as Anne was alluding to earlier, and as we talked about online, she's got all these job openings she can't fill. Within the center, also as part of building this pipeline, these are just some numbers that I thought might be interesting for you to see in terms of the number of students that have graduated and the types of degrees. So we've had a total of 106 students who have been supported by Trust since the center started graduate. This past year, you can see the numbers here, 21 PhDs and 2 master's degrees. And the graph, it's a little bit of an eye chart, I apologize, but you can kind of see roughly the average is 15 a year. So these are primarily graduate students, almost all PhDs. I mean, if you average out the other numbers, there have been some MBAs, some law students, some master's students, but these are mostly PhD students who are coming out of engineering, computer science, information programs that have spent most of their time, except for the ones very early on, working in the security field or privacy or looking at something related to cyber infrastructure. So these are people who now are postdocs, are professors now. Some have gone into industry. So we're pretty pleased with this, and this is something we actively track to kind of make sure that we know what these students are doing, because at the end of the day, this is one of the big impacts that the center's had, and I think one of the things that has really been valuable about the NSF investment in the Trust Center. And you can see, just for information, the demographics of the center there as well. Our underrepresented minorities, 14%, females at 26%, mostly U.S. persons across the center. So, they're certainly not what we would like them to be. We'd like them to be higher compared to things like the Talby survey. That's kind of what we use as our measuring stick. We're certainly higher than the national averages, but we're doing all we can to recruit and bring in more female and minority students into the program as well. And I mentioned the REU students on the previous slide that most of them have gone on to grad school. So we track them as well too. And so you can see through last summer's cohort, 85%. Actually, sorry, through 2011, this doesn't include the ones from last summer, have gone on to graduate school. So again, this was a lot of students, some of whom maybe were thinking about graduate school anyway, but a lot of them were not sure. And so just through informal surveys and feedback we've gotten from them, a lot of them have told us that this experience really sort of tipped them in favor of going to graduate school and pursuing it. And these are just a few of the places where they've gone. So some have been accepted at trust partner institutions. Others have gone elsewhere to some of the schools listed here. from an outreach perspective, I mentioned a little bit earlier about what we do to engage with researchers outside the center. So we have a fairly large team across Trust that pulls in people from a number of leading institutions, but we certainly are not insular, and we certainly look to get involved in people outside of that. So this is not a representative list, but I wanted to mention a few of the activities that we've sponsored. And I will say to date, to the point this morning about funding workshops and so forth, I mean, we've actually been fortunate in that we've carved off some of the funding that we've gotten from NSF to fund these workshops. And so obviously it's one of these things that can't necessarily sustain itself once the funding ends. But what we've tried to do with some of these is establish them and get them going, and then either find sponsorship for them or partner with professional societies so that we can keep them going beyond the initial maybe first couple of years where Trust makes the investment to keep the workshops or seminars going. But we've done a number of things such as YTAP, which is looking at, actually fairly early on was looking at this whole problem of online tracking and targeted advertising, which is kind of blown up in the last year or two. But early on, John Mitchell and his group at Stanford and Chris Hufnagel, who's a law fellow at Berkeley, were really driving a lot of the issues around how people are being tracked with cookies and other techniques, even when you turned off your cookies, about how you could track what's being your activity online, even when you don't want it to be tracked. And so that was one of the early workshops there. We've had some involvement with Homeland Security, including hosting Secretary Napolitano a couple of times. Janos Stepanovich at Vanderbilt ran a dog school workshop that was kind of started to look more at cyber-physical systems, sort of carving off the physical infrastructures piece of the work that we do, that was looking at sort of fundamental ways in which those systems are engineered. And a nice report came out of that. The last few years, we've been involved pretty closely with Idaho National Lab, and they run, Craig Rieger and his group runs this ISRCS, and we helped organize some of it last year and the year before, and then this year we're a sponsor of it. The symposium's going to be in San Francisco, and we're a sponsor of that. And in fact, we've kind of helped them broaden it out into this. They're calling it now Resilience Week, and so they've got kind of modeled after this CPS Week or Cyber Physical Systems Week. They're going to have 3 separate conferences that run in parallel. One of which was more the controls conference. One is more on security, and then one is more on human factors. And so it's actually grown quite a bit over the last few years. To Craig's credit, he's really promoted that quite a bit. But we're pleased with the support that Trust has provided there. As far as cyber physical systems, we started a few years ago a workshop back in 2010, a one-day workshop that was looking at security issues around essentially control systems at the time. In 2011, we broadened it a little bit, and then in 2012, we actually got a brand new conference sponsored by ACM, added to the other 4 that are part of CPS Week. It was a 2-day conference, and then this year we're in the process of finalizing plans for the 2013 conference, which will be in April, and we've expanded it to 3 days. And so we've got a number of papers that we've accepted for that. We've got some keynote speakers and some panel tracks and so forth. And so this is really a way in which we're looking to kind of broaden the community of people looking at this area of high confidence network systems, which again, some of it kind of builds off of this physical infrastructures work that Trust did, but we've tried to broaden it to be much more inclusive, to bring in work that people are doing from a number of other institutions. And then we have some people that are involved, Nick Doty in particular, who's on this tracking protection working group of the W3C. And this is kind of we sponsored a workshop back in November at Berkeley that was looking at, essentially, W3C is trying to come up with standards for this online tracking. And this was an interesting workshop that brought in some industry people, some government agencies, the standards bodies, and a number of academic researchers to talk through issues and ways in which W3C could really make a difference in this area, this sort of online tracking area. And so there were some interesting results that came out of that as well, and some recommendations that came out that the W3C is now in the process of working on. So the last area I wanted to mention was what we do with our industry partners. And so, one of the ways in which we work with one of the reasons we work with industry is really to transition the research that's coming out of the universities and not just have it end up in papers and reports and things like that, which are all well and good, but we really like to be able to work on real world problems and partner with people who are real subject matter experts in particular areas. So essentially, technology transition is our motivation here, and listed here are a number of the companies that we work with. We've also leveraged a lot of the investment from NSF to establish projects with other government agencies. So we've got the science of security work is Brad and others are funding that from NSA. We had a 3-year project with the Air Force that was looking at security for of the GIG, the Global Information Grid, kind of their internet, and next generation sort of network-centric operations, sort of their next generation of how they were going to operate in the field. We have some work with DARPA that's looking at a number of security areas. They've got a pretty substantial portfolio of security projects, as you probably know. And then we've also worked, as ICAST was a multi-year project that we had between Berkeley and Carnegie Mellon that was with Taiwan, and that was looking at a number of security issues that they were experiencing. They kind of are in a unique position, obviously, with mainland China right there. So there were a number of things they were looking at in terms of ubiquitous computing and reliability of their systems and how they could resist various types of attacks. And it was research that we did with them, but they also had these kind of quasi-government agencies that really looked to transition the technology to a number of their industry partners over in Taiwan. We've also, CSID is a center that's at Queen's University Belfast. We've had some partnerships with them, and Amrita is a university in India, and we've are talking with them about establishing a cybersecurity, sort of a joint research and education program with them. So I wanted to mention, related to this, and I don't know how this relates to the model with I3P, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the benefits to us and also the companies in our industrial partnership program. So one of the things, and some of this is kind of how we pitch it to the companies, but obviously the companies have a lot of direct say. If they're going to fund our research, they have a lot of direct say in the research direction and ways in which the research results are used. They certainly get access to our faculty and our students directly. We also have a pretty open IP model, and we were able to establish early on an agreement that all the institutions bought into about essentially not taking a really strong IP position, so we could make the research attractive to companies. It's kind of modeled on this NERF, this non-exclusive royalty-free model that we think is very favorable to industry. So for companies that sponsor the research, they have first rights to it for a pretty substantial period of time, and then the research is opened up to other member companies and partners. We have a visiting industrial fellow program, so they can place researchers on site with any one of our partner institutions. And then our external advisory board also has companies, if they fund the center at a certain level, they're able to place somebody on our external advisory board. So we feel like if they're invested enough in the center and have enough interest in what we're doing, that warrants a position on our board. And certainly from our perspective, I mentioned earlier, students love to work on real world problems. They're very entrepreneurial. They're very motivated to tackle real issues that are out there. And so by partnering with these companies, we get to hear firsthand some of the problems that they're dealing with. Occasionally there are non-disclosure agreements or something that need to be signed, but we certainly work through all of that pretty easily. But that also gives us access to their subject matter expertise, as I said, and some of the insight into some of the problems that they're dealing with. We've also had proposal teams or teaming opportunities come out of some of these relationships. So as you get a chance to work together with industry partners, they get to know about you and your research group, and you get to know more about what they do. And also, I was talking to Ann, a lot of these companies, recruiting is very competitive, especially when, as you all know, the pool of students studying security is very small, and the need out there is very large. And so we found that companies like to have sort of an entree into any of the research groups that are producing a number of good security students, because those will be their next generation of employees and practitioners for those who are finishing their undergraduate or graduate studies. So I think I'll wrap up with this. We feel Trust has actually been very successful. We're in our 8th of our 10th year. I think I may have mentioned earlier. So we've been pretty pleased with the results we've seen so far. The multidisciplinary and multi-institutional aspects of it, there were some growing pains at the beginning. It was not sort of a traditional way of doing things. But we feel like now one of the benefits of this is we have a number of our faculty and students in particular even who are working with people outside of their departments. And I know that that's becoming a little bit more the norm these days, but we really feel that's been very beneficial to us, and we've been able to leverage the size and scope of the center to really pull in all these disciplines. We've made pretty substantial effort in each of the 3 research areas that I talked about earlier. There are a whole number of projects I didn't get into in the interest of time, but in some ways, we've kind of been on the forefront in a lot of these areas. And I mentioned ID theft, cybercrime, malware. So a lot of these things we were looking at very early on back in 2005, 2006. The last few years, we've kind of gotten more into some of these areas like securing cyber physical and cyber infrastructure systems. And so we're trying to kind of stay ahead of where some of the problems are. I talked a little bit about some of the impacts we've had in education and diversity, and we feel pretty proud about the numbers that we've produced there. And our success stories with knowledge transfer and technology adoption, essentially transitioning the results of the research out of the center. So there was a comment earlier about sort of this public-private partnership, and we feel pretty successful that we're pretty confident we've been successful in this academic industry government model, which can be a little challenging at times to implement, but certainly we feel like we've made it work well, and there are a number of lessons learned and other things I'd be happy to share either now or informally. But we certainly are looking for additional partners, and I think I'd mentioned to a few of you earlier on if there are ways in which trust projects or trust researchers could collaborate more closely with I3P, we'd certainly be willing to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I don't know how we're doing on time. I guess it's about 10 minutes, so.
Let me just
If there are any
answer that
questions,
question.
sure.
Yeah, working with companies, research agreements with companies, did you run into any challenges over publication restrictions that the company wanted to impose on faculty? No, but I know of groups that have had that problem. But the projects that we've had funded, no, we haven't had that issue. We have, though, with DARPA and some other agencies. Yeah. I mean, so we've had to deal with that, certainly, and we've had to kind of negotiate into our terms. You've managed to work around it. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I think actually our Industrial Alliance Office they've kind of gone to bat for us with that, because that's, at least within the University of California, that's pretty much a no-no. It's kind of a showstopper. They won't allow that. And then we come up with something that's actually workable if they really have some.
I'd be very interested to know more details, because I know, that's
Sure.
why I asked the question, because I imagine the California system is very much a
Yes.
bright line at that point.
They are. And a lot of the industry partnerships we've had, for example, with HP, it's been with HP Labs. So they're used to kind of working in this research and development environment, so they understand the value of getting the results out quickly and allowing students to publish and so forth. Any other questions?
You talked about some work that your organization did with some, I think, Scandinavian companies,
Right.
Developing I think a more secure SCADA systems
grid.
or
Right.
control systems.
Yeah.
what was the product of that? Was that just internal analyses of their networks, or did you, were there new designs, new actual things that could be used in the U.S. market coming out from that?
Right. So this was the this Viking project that we had with the Swedish Power Network, and there were a couple things that we did. One was it was more of an analysis of the types of threats against the control systems, and then we developed some of the algorithms to improve the processes, and then essentially they were kind of handed off to the industry partners on the team to implement. So we kind of left it at sort of that algorithm level, and we published some of the aspects of that, but then the implementation of it was left to the rest of the team. Yes, sure.
When you're working with companies, do you have a sense of why they're working with you rather than with consultants? Is it price? Is it expertise? I mean, exactly how have you defined your niche? Because
Right.
to be honest, sometimes when we've talked to companies, and a lot of the ones on your list are technology companies, so I'm talking more about other companies that rely on technology, but that's not their primary focus. They often want us to do work for them, but they don't. They want to treat us more like consultants, and
Right.
and that doesn't. It goes to some of Martin's questions. It doesn't always fit very well with the model of how we work. So I'm curious to learn from your experience.
Yeah, and we're the same way. So, right, universities don't do contract work, right, as you all know. And so I think maybe we've just been fortunate in that the projects, only a couple times has it potentially kind of gotten into an area where it seemed like it was contract work, but it was, my experience is that the companies we've worked with have really been interested in tapping into the fundamental research that we're doing, and they understand that it's graduate students and faculty doing this. These are not, professional engineers and or professional consultants that they're hiring. So we haven't really had that hasn't been a real sticking point with us with any of the companies. But you're right. I mean, most of the companies we work with, they're IT companies, they're other technology companies, they're security companies, and internally they do research and development in some form. So they're kind of used to working that way, versus maybe a product company that might be more interested in a very specific deliverable from a team. And that, I think, we'd probably steer away from that, I think, just because the nature of the work isn't really what we do. Questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you. I'll be around for a while.